Welcome back to the channel, everybody. I know it's been a little while since I made a video. I took a pretty significant break from YouTube at the pretty much the end of June and the entire month of July. I do think I posted some videos in July, but I wasn't really playing video games, and that was for personal reasons. But we're back, and this is Break the Backlog, the show where I sit down and provide my thoughts, opinions, and personal stories about a particular game that I've been playing. Today marks yet another game that I've completed for the first time that was a game from my childhood, which also happens to be the first of its series that I've ever beaten as well, and that is The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. This is another game that I owned my entire life, and I never really got around to finishing, although this one is mostly because as a kid I was genuinely scared of Majora's Mask. The scene where the mask guy flips out on you for not getting the titular mask back gave me nightmares, and I specifically remember that being the reason why I never came back to finish this game, even though I had done those first 3 days many times. Now, after beating it as an adult, I can confirm that based on the E for Everyone rating it was given at the time, yeah, this would be pretty creepy for a kid to experience. The horror flavor and my love of the macabre was why I decided that the first Zelda game I wanted to finish had to be Majora's Mask. After all the horror games we've experienced on this channel, it just felt right. Without further ado, sit back, relax, grab yourself a snack while we break the backlog on my first ever completed Zelda title, Majora's Mask. The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask is the 6th title in the long and storied Legend of Zelda franchise, and it was released in the year 2000 for the Nintendo 64. It is a sequel of sorts to the previous entry Ocarina of Time, as this game follows the same timeline's Link in a new world called Termina. This game marked the second in the series to adopt the 3D style graphics at the time, and received critical praise that highlighted its unique 3-day Groundhog Day style progression, as well as its darker and more horror-tinged world and character design. While no game could have totally stepped out of the massive shadow cast by the juggernaut that was Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask has become immensely popular with fans and stepped into its own as a cult classic, with many finding a love of the game's horror-adjacent aesthetic that kind of stepped outside of the fellow Nintendo releases of the time. It was re-released in 2003 as a part of the Legend of Zelda Collector's Edition for the GameCube, and later again as a 3DS remake in 2015. The former was the game that I owned as a kid, which was a compilation disc that featured Majora's Mask as well as Ocarina of Time, the first 2 Zelda games I believe, and a 30-minute demo for Wind Waker. It also had a special presentation that looked at the Zelda games over the years, and you know, this disc just really represented a great value, and I think it still does with 4 games included. And I spent a lot of time on this as a kid, just being really terrible at this collection and never finishing any of these games, as anyone who watches this channel has become well aware of. Well, all of that stuff in the past has been pushed to the side, and for the last week of my life, I've played nothing other than Majora's Mask. And now, let's talk a bit about the history of this title and how it came to be. After the immense success of Ocarina of Time, the original plan for Majora's Mask was to create what would have been more or less an equivalent to a DLC second quest, in which the game was flipped after its completion. There were talks of reimagining the original game world with a harder difficulty and dungeons that were flipped in design. This title was known as Zelda and was slated to be released for the Nintendo 64's disk drive, though this was later reconsidered, and probably for good reason. The 64 disk drive would be released after many delays in Japan in February of 1999, though it would be discontinued just 2 years later. Nintendo would state that Ocarina of Time Master Quest was what Zelda was supposed to be, with its flipped dungeons and harder difficulty, though this is disputed by data miners who went through the Nintendo data leak that happened, the massive one, and this information was shared with YouTuber Legendary Adventures by ZethN64, who has worked a great deal on uncovering the facts of the Zelda era game. I will go ahead and put Legendary Adventures video in the description. It was really helpful for me when I was putting together this video, and just this section specifically. So if you want to find out more about the kind of steps that came before Majora's Mask actually was a game, go check out that video. It's really good. Aside from issues with the disk drive, there was also some pushback from lead designer of the dungeons, Eiji Aonuma, as he was not interested in flipping the dungeons that he had just created for Ocarina of Time. He stated in an interview with Iwata Asks, "As someone who had just been in charge of the dungeons, I just couldn't get excited over making a flip side to them." Aonuma began instead working on new dungeons in his spare time while he mustered up the courage to push for a new Zelda game. Thus, a small team was challenged to complete a completely new Zelda game in just 1 year using the same game engine that was used to develop Ocarina of Time. The time crunch definitely took its toll on the team, with many being forced to work long days away from their family due to being on such a small development cycle window. Odes to this tough year of development hell were even placed within the game's script, with scriptwriter Mitsuhiro Takano sharing just that with the Japanese publication. "We put our feelings into the mouths of the Termini residents," he said. All of the findings within these Japanese magazines were uncovered by Did You Know Gaming here on YouTube, and they featured quite a bit of insight into just how intense the work environment really was in this crunch year. But after all of the long work days and intense work hours, Majora's Mask was finally finished in just 15 months. While critics were ready to throw praise on this game just as they had with its predecessor, some gamers were split with its darker toned Zelda. These gamers found that the time limit was just too stressful and that it didn't lend itself to allow them to explore the world to their heart's content. In my research of this game, I still found comments about the time limit mechanic being too much or being attributed to why some fans never enjoyed or even played Majora's Mask, though it does seem like by and large this game became beloved in its own right over the years, with many who played it citing it as one of their favorite games of not only the Zelda series, but gaming in general. So how did I feel after beating this game for the first time? Let's get into it. This game is one of those older titles whose art styles really hold up pretty well, all things considered. Sure, there's some ugly textures or some slowdowns and frame drops as textures load in, though as a whole I never felt like it detracted from my experience. In many ways actually, a lot of the rougher textures added to the uncanny horror elements of the game and helped to build that more tense and creepy atmosphere that this game centers its narrative around. Our young version of Link still looks like he did back in Ocarina of Time, which makes him one of a few items of familiarity in this new world. It doesn't take all that long, however, for our hero to find himself in a dire situation, and for those creepier tones and themes to become more present. These are set brilliantly in juxtaposition to Link, who we know is a hero of legend, and as such he exists as a pillar of light within this doomed world. In fact, a lot of the design decisions included here do a great job at reinforcing that we are in a pretty dire situation here. I mean, the moon literally gets closer to the town as the day wears on, and its pretty unhinged expression looming over the land of Termina is just disturbing, and just imagining ourselves living there would be horrifying. The bells of the clock tower that ominously play as the day becomes night and nights turn back to day once more remind us that we are on a time crunch here. This pressure of time is also accompanied by the shrinking screen that grows smaller and smaller with each strike of the bell as the days come to a close. Through these visual elements, the sense of mounting pressure is just done so well, but these are just some of the examples of how the world of Termina helps paint that dreadful events will occur if Link should fail in his quest. I totally get why people back in the day, or even now, if they try Majora's Mask and all of these elements working together to make you feel like, man, this is not a long time for me to be able to get all this done, I can get why that feeling of like that being over your head could be overwhelming for some people. And like I said, yeah, there's some aged textures and stuff, but there is some charm to Majora's Mask which just shines through despite the polygonal characters and sometimes rough textures and pop-in. Call it nostalgia, but it works, and I really did find a lot to love about the way this game presented itself. As I stated earlier, Link retains his younger look from the Ocarina of Time and dons his iconic green tunic and hat that have been present for many of the titles in this series. There are other odes to previous games that are thrown into the blender with this spooky environment, like Link's horse Epona, and the appearance of fairies being those of the ones in Ocarina of Time. While these inclusions made someone like me, who had beaten a significant amount of Ocarina of Time before, more comfortable, other recurring characters within this title are used to do the exact opposite. The Happy Mask Salesman is an unnerving addition, and as I stated before, this freak really put me out of wanting to ever pick this game up again as a kid. Also, Skull Kid appearing in this game as the wearer of the sinister Majora's Mask also puts him in juxtaposition of these other familiar characters. And the design of Majora's Mask itself is just such an iconic and downright awesome looking mask that really gives this treacherous vibe to the story. I really loved all the masks in this title for the most part, though they all pale in comparison to the main bad guys. As far as the performance goes, I did have some frame drops in the more populated areas of the game, or large parts of various dungeons, and there were some times where some frustrating crashes made me lose quite a bit of progress because this game's unique saving system is odd, which we'll get to. But aside from these few moments, the presentation from a visual standpoint has aged pretty well in my opinion, and it definitely was serviceable, if not excellent, considering the time in which this game was released, and I was thoroughly impressed with just how playable and immersive this game could be. The sound is another huge place of quality within Majora's Mask, with the soundtrack in particular being some of the best video game music I have ever heard in my entire life. In fact, the music from this game is one of the things that I remembered most about my time with it as a kid, as a lot of these songs, whether they are a part of the in-game soundtrack or tunes that you learn on the Ocarina, are just beautiful and memorable. The title theme of this game is one of my favorite video game songs, with its simple plucked melody accompanied by both strings and woodwind instruments that combine into just a beautiful composition. This game features a wide range of vibes to its tracks as well, with some of the more beautiful songs being those like Song of Storms, featuring that just whimsical bounce, in contrast to songs like Majora's theme, which have a sinister sound that lets you know that if we can't stop this bug-eyed freak, it's gonna get real. The soundtrack is just perfect to me, and every area within the game has music that blends with its visuals, cultures, and denizens within these realms. As for the rest of the sound design, it's pretty flawless as well, as sound cues for enemies and puzzles are clear and identifiable. Link's attack yells are as iconic as ever, with him choreographing most if not all of his big attacks with his battle cries, and the sound of his sword finding its way into a foe being a satisfying thunk. They all did their jobs. I thought that the scream that Link lets out when he puts on a mask that changes his form, as well as the cutscenes that accompany the transformations, were really well done, and once again built upon this creepy foundation that this game is conceived from. It sounds like these transformations and their masks are painful to our hero to go through, and there is a ton of mask switching and form changing in this game. It's pretty depressing to think about how Link would feel that every time he has to activate one of these powers. While most of the sounds here were really well done, there are some annoying repeating sounds that you will hear throughout the game because of the nature of replaying through the days. This includes the one witch sister who owns the item shop in the swamp, her annoying cry that she does when she finds out her sister is hurt, and there's some more that are kind of like that, but I can't even remember them off the top of my head, to be honest with you, so they weren't that big of a deal. Sounds are mostly a strong point in favor of Majora's Mask, with the soundtrack being the massive masterpiece that it is. The gameplay of Majora's Mask is at its core a Zelda game through and through. In the simplest terms, you play as Link, you go through the story until you hit a dungeon, you explore that dungeon, kill the boss, rinse, and repeat. And these mechanics work just as well as they always do. The dungeons are cleverly designed to incorporate the various form changes and powers that these forms bestow upon Link, and eventually the later dungeons may even require Link to change forms between his available masks multiple times within its depths. As you explore these dungeons, players will find tools that can also help them navigate the map and fight enemies that range from the bow and arrow to the iconic hookshot. These unlocks often serve dual purposes in really clever ways, like how they're built upon as exploration mechanics that the dungeon teaches to the player, and then later being applied and reimagined to be offensive skills to utilize in the encounters with bosses and mini-bosses. And the boss fights in this game are a blast. Each one sees Link facing down a massive foe that has plagued the biome that it's home to, and these formidable foes can sometimes be pretty tricky to take down, especially for a person who has never seen a Zelda game all the way through. With all of these tools and the various forms at your disposal, I was pleasantly surprised at how streamlined most of the fighting in this game felt. The sword attacks that Link can use depend whether or not you are Z-targeting on an enemy or not, which is the game's kind of lock-on mechanic that has been carried over from Ocarina of Time. And these sword swings or stabs can all be controlled with the direction that you're moving while you're Z-targeting. If you're not Z-targeting, you can kind of just flail around your sword like crazy. Regular Link's sword and shield offer a lot of versatility in combat, as well as his ability to use the aforementioned tools like the bow, hookshot, and bombs. While the other forms cannot use many of the items that Link has access to, they each have their own unique mechanics that can be found in a variety of combat situations. The Deku Scrub form is incredibly fast, and the spin attack that Link uses in this form can stun enemies so that they become vulnerable to regular Link's sword attacks. The Goron form gives Link the ability to use fire-infused punches and smash into the ground, hurting nearby foes. It also allows Link to build up speed and roll into enemies that cause damage. And finally, the Zora form allows Link to use a magic shield that hurts enemies he swims into and ground enemies alike, as well as the ability to throw batarang-like fins at enemies from afar. These three forms are the ones that players will use in a majority of this title, and each form felt like its usefulness would be called upon occasionally, so that no mask ever truly felt underused or like it fell to the wayside. This is also true of the puzzles throughout this game, where different masks were used to complete cleverly designed areas made to test the player's problem solving. Puzzles are something that I'm usually pretty terrible at, and admittedly I did have to refer to a walkthrough at some points throughout this game. But overall, the puzzles here, while sometimes challenging, never felt impossible to solve, and I appreciated that greatly. The form changes are just one of the many ways that this game deviates from its predecessor. The other one is the far more controversial addition of a time limit. As I said earlier, there are players out there who feel like this time limit alienated them, and they have found that the pressure is too great to really get invested in this title, which I think is fair. I cannot tell you how many times as a kid I got to see the moon crashing into Termina because my little brain was too small to figure out how to make my way past the Deku Castle with stealth. This time, however, I was able to finish that first dungeon for the first time, and finding ways to manipulate the time is something that eventually becomes second nature. This is achieved through using different versions of the Song of Time. Playing through it in reverse will slow the rate at which time passes, down to almost a crawl, allowing players to take advantage of the much longer days here to get things done. Conversely, playing every note twice will skip time to the nearest day or night. This allows players to more readily access events that happen on certain days or at certain times. I spoke a little bit earlier about the saving mechanic in this game and how it was used and caused me some frustration with crashes. In Majora's Mask, playing the regular Song of Time causes Link to be transported back to the dawn of the first day, resetting most of his progress, emptying his wallet and pockets of non-key items like arrows and bombs, but also allowing the player to save their progress. This mechanic and when to use it is one that takes some time getting used to, as there's only a few things that will stick around after a reset. What is frustrating is when you are in the middle of a cycle where you have made a ton of progress, but not really enough that saving would be beneficial, and then your game crashes and you lose all of that progress. Luckily, I think this only happened once or twice to me, and most of the time, the saving mechanic was just another system to learn and adapt to. The time management, as I said earlier, becomes second nature after a while, and it's a gameplay mechanic that felt really unique to me, as I haven't played a ton of games that have this restraint attached to it. Aside from the combat and time management, players will also be able to explore the pretty large world of Termina, where there are tons of side quests to partake in that often lead to some very useful rewards, or even masks that have different effects. Collecting all of the masks in this game is a pretty big accomplishment and leads to an awesome in-game power-up towards the end of the game, though this wasn't something that I did in my playthrough. Just the sheer number of extra masks to find in this game is impressive, with some allowing you to walk right past enemies and avoid detection, others allowing you to command the dead, and one that lets you do this. A lot of these side quests are just gathering items or using other in-game things or songs you learn to appease the quest giver, but they often lead to hilarious or neat interactions, like giving this extended hand a land deed so he can wipe his ass despite him having tissues right next to him. Now, this isn't to say that every mechanic of this nearly 30-year-old game has aged perfectly in my opinion. Something that did feel a bit bad and dated was to use the first-person aiming mechanic for any of the tools that require the player to make precise shots, with the rather clunky C-stick aiming that often led me to missing arrows or hook shots. Luckily, a lot of this can be circumnavigated, at least in a combat sense, by using the Z targeting system that found its way over from Ocarina of Time. This system can also be used in some of the exploration areas, though when it isn't available, and say the goal is to hit a moving target, it did feel a bit counterintuitive and, like I said, clunky. First person just wasn't a great feel, whether it be the bow, hook shot, or blasting bubbles as a Deku scrub. There were also times when dungeons started to feel like a slog, more so when an annoying enemy killed me and I would have to trek my way all the way back through the dungeon to face them once again, maybe multiple times, because I suck. This was mostly noticeable in the stone and water temples, as the mid-level bosses there kicked my ass a few times and saw me having to make my way back through the large sections of the dungeon just to pull up and get smoked again. Luckily, the doors and puzzles had been solved and they had stayed that way, so mostly it was just a boring walk back to the room, trying not to get hit too much to conserve my health for what was proving to be a really difficult fight. All of that being said, this game was extremely fun, which I think is evident by the fact that I played this game and only this game until I finished it. It took my attention and really got me invested in its fluid combat, intricate dungeon designs, and big boss encounters. The gameplay loop is really solid here, and despite the flaws and aged mechanics that I spoke of, it is easy to see why Majora's Mask is beloved by so many. Majora's Mask follows Link a short time after the events of Ocarina of Time as he becomes entrenched in the new world called Termina. This was not by his own choice, as Skull Kid, who was also from Ocarina of Time, makes another appearance in the series, steals Epona and Link's ocarina before turning him into a Deku scrub and setting out to destroy the world. From here, Link is tasked with retrieving his ocarina and returning Majora's Mask to the Happy Mask salesman. Should these items not be retrieved, the moon will crash into Termina in 3 days and wipe out all of its inhabitants. Throughout his journey, Link will meet and befriend many different denizens of Termina and the different areas of the world where their unique customs, cultures, and habitats reside. Many of the world of Termina have been affected by Skull Kid's antics, and Link walks behind the troublesome boy, cleaning up his messes and setting the world back in order to save people from certain disaster. Through gathering masks that allow him to take the forms of the various peoples of Termina, Link is tasked with uniting 4 giants from the corresponding biomes to help hold back the massive moon, and through using his ocarina to manipulate the very fabric of time itself, Link has his work cut out for him. The narrative here is really interesting, as I have mentioned time and time again. It does such a wonderful job in communicating these dark undertones and themes of death, forgiveness, and loneliness that I felt like really got me invested. I enjoyed the story and finding out much more about this world and the people within it, as well as exploring and seeing just how much chaos and destruction Majora's Mask was able to cause in kind of a short time to all these residents of Termina. I try to never spoil these stories too much in these reviews because I know some of you guys might want to check this game out, and this one is actually readily available if you have the Switch Online service that has like the Nintendo 64 stuff. And this review will be no different. This game's narrative is one that mingles so well with its presentation and gameplay, and it really is a fantastic story about loneliness and abandonment. A lot of Skull Kid's actions embody that saying, that a child will burn down a village to feel its warmth. So, how is Majora's Mask as a whole package? I gotta say that the dark and horror adjacent undertones within this game's plot really pulled me in, as well as the aesthetics, and after researching and finding out that many of the game's intricacies or dialogue and secrets were reflecting that of tired and overworked employees, all of this kind of comes together that makes me feel like this game is just a masterpiece in itself. It still looks great considering the time that it was made in, the music is just out of this world fantastic, the combat feels snappy and fun while also providing a challenge in some of the more intense fights, the narrative offers huge stakes and consequences should the time limit not be respected, and all of it just works to combine into a game that really just blew me away with how high quality and beautiful all of its parts coming together really was. Majora's Mask is easily one of the best video games I've played not only this year, but probably of all time, and if you have a Switch and the ability to play this game, or a Nintendo 64, or a GameCube, you owe it to yourself to experience this game. I really cannot recommend it enough. Thank you for watching this video, I really appreciate you guys, and I am finally back from that extended break, so if you don't want to miss me sharing my thoughts on more games, please consider subscribing and liking the video as that helps me out immensely. Any suggestions for what I should play next? Leave them in the comments below, and until next time, take care of yourself, Blooper Troops. Peace.